we have people just trickling in slowly, but I think we're going to make a start so that we have plenty of time. We've allowed a little bit longer now than we started off with these webinars, so we've got an hour and a half. And I'd like to really welcome you all to this. This is the third webinar in our series on power and the Church of England, which is hosted by the Michael Ramsey Centre for Anglican Studies at Durham University and the Department of Politics and Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University. My name's Liz Graveling, and I'm one of the people who's part of the steering group for these webinars. I'm based in the Church of England's Ministry Development team. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome another person who's part of that steering group, the Reverend Canon Dr. Anderson Jeremiah, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster. And Anderson is going to be talking to us about colonialism and power in the Church of England. So what we're going to do is have, Anderson is going to speak for about 45 minutes. Then we'll take a very short break, a really short one, and then we can use the rest of the time for question and answers from you. When it comes to that, we're going to be taking questions from the floor, as it were. So I'd ask you to use the button on the screen to raise your hand so we can see that you'd like to speak. Do feel free to use the chat as well, but only you do that, please, after Anderson has finished speaking, because it can be really distracting otherwise for him. And we'll try to pick up on some of the things that are coming out through the chat as well. I'd ask you to please turn your camera off and make sure you're muted unless you're speaking. It just means that for some people, they get a better connection. That's all. The other people you'll see on screen will be our wonderful signers who will take it in turns to translate into British Sign Language for us. And I should also mention, you'll have seen as you've joined that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on websites and on social media, so just be aware of that as well. But I think that's all I've got to say. So welcome again, Anderson, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Liz, and let me get my PowerPoint. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Obviously, colonialism and the Church of England and the discussion around power is a very vast field. Obviously, I will not be able to cover all those different aspects. Instead, what I wish to do this afternoon is to try and kind of define some of the basic aspects and how I am approaching this particular theme, and also to kind of limit our attention and our focus to some of the key issues and try and reflect how we can understand history and how history shapes our knowledge and therefore the kind of understanding that we have of power. This is part of the ongoing reflection that we have in these webinars and trying to understand how we define, understand power within the Church of England. One of the areas that I've chosen to reflect on is the idea of colonialism and how I approach it from the aspect of post-colonial and decolonial approaches, and then try and look at some instances in the history that shapes some of the processes that we come to understand and take for granted within the Church of England today. So the idea that I have is to kind of help you reflect in this process, and hopefully we will have a better sense how we understand the history and how we make sense of it in our present context. So to begin with, I think just to colonialism itself is a very broad area of a subject. So within that, how we can kind of limit our focus. What I would like to kind of alert you is the kind of standard definition that many of us could see, from the concise Oxford Dictionary: the policy or practice of acquiring political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. Within this, we should also kind of limit our own understanding with reference to the kind of Western European colonialism, which is a political and economic phenomenon whereby various European nations explored, conquered, settled, and exploited large areas of the world as it has been understood within this context. So what this basically means is the establishment of domination of a geographically extended political unit. Most often, it is inhabited by people of different race, ethnicity, and culture, where this domination is political and economic. And the colony, as in this case, exists subordinated. And these are very important concepts, where subordination and dependent on the mother country. So that's a very important perspective to keep in mind. It's also important to keep in mind how colonialism existed in order to impose, as Edward Said articulated, that the superiority of the European way of life on that of the Oriental, as he called it, a colonization of minds and bodies as much as that of space and economies, and much harder to transcend or throw off. So these are lasting legacies of colonization as we understand. The key thing is that it was also a very critical understanding that it's an unequal system of commodity exchange, how people, nations, and countries have been commodified in that process. So colonialism, in other words, is a form of temporally extended domination by people over other people, and as such, part of the historical universe of forms of intergroup domination, subjugation, oppression, and exploitation. So these are the basic building blocks of understanding colonialism. So imperialism is the other expression where a policy, this is a political policy of extending a country's power and influence through colonization, use of military force or other means. And finally, imperialism took different types. They are direct and indirect imperial rule, and there were protectorates, and also spheres of influence, and finally a company rule. So you're ruling a particular space through a third party who subjects to your power. So that leads me to where I am looking at this particular perspective. That's mostly from a post-colonialism perspective. So what is post-colonialism? So post-colonialism stems from the idea that colonialism and imperialism fostered a long process of continued domination of the West over the rest of the world, and cultural, economic, and political domination still characterizes global politics. So this is a fundamental kind of a lens or a commitment from which you analyze the colonial predicament. So post-colonialism, in other words, examines the experiences of societies, governments, and peoples in the formerly colonized regions of the world. So in principle, what it means is that you have to critically examine how all these structures existed. So what is decolonization then? So in its most skeletal form, according to Premwada Gopal, a very important scholar of decolonization, she argues that it's a process which signifies the end of rule by a foreign power and the recuperation and or formation of an independent entity, usually a nation state, through a process often referred to as transfer of power. So you're recognizing, yes, there has been independence, but at the same time, you also recognize how some of the residual elements of colonization exist. Yemiolo, another important scholar, argues that to decolonize is to fundamentally transform knowledge production. It means that the unquestioned value systems that has been imposed that governs what knowledge is and how it is produced, and who is allowed to be a knowing and knowledgeable agent must be radically reshaped. So this is the fundamental commitment of decolonization, to transform knowledge production. So in other words, decoloniality, as we understand, is a way for us to relearn the knowledge that has been pushed aside, forgotten, buried, or discredited by the forces of modernity, colonialism and capitalism. So this is the fundamental premise from which I will be examining some of the aspects of Church of England. Before we go into that, of course, we also need to define what we mean by power. So obviously, in this part of this webinar, we have been exploring various aspects of power, but I start with a familiar social theorist, Michel Foucault. What he argues is that power must be analyzed as something which only functions in the form of a chain. It is never localized here and there, never in anybody's hands, never appropriated as a commodity or a piece of wealth. Power is employed and exercised through a net-like organization. So what he helped us, building on various analytical understanding of power, Foucault provided a very nuanced understanding of how power works. But of course, there are limitations to what Foucault can help us with, how we make sense of power. Stuart Clegg, another very important social theorist, argues that a theory of power must examine how the field of force in which power is arranged has been fixed, coupled, and constituted in such a way that intentionally or not, certain nodal points of practice are privileged in this unstable and shifting terrain. So what Clegg argued is that we need to understand power in the context of field of force, how things operate, not just in a chain, in an invisible form, but also we need to understand how it has been located within particular systems. Of course, from a kind of a subaltern post-colonial perspective, Gayatri Spivak offers a fascinating expansion on what Foucault offered. Spivak argues that power is being able to do something. And in many ways, she kind of simplifies the understanding of power. And she argues that because you're able to make sense of it, power describes the experience of common sense necessary for human function in the world. And she argues that the normality of subject is very, very important. So in all this, what we are trying to understand is the idea, the process, the dynamic nature of power, and also how we make sense of the relational element of power. And of course, we can't get away from the fact that it is also, there's force, authority, subordination, violence, exclusion, inclusion. And this is where I would like to link it back to how we made sense of colonialism and the colonized existence, where force, authority, subordination, violence, and exclusion, and to a certain extent inclusion, was shaped. Now, having kind of explored what colonialism, post-colonialism, and power means, I would like to now turn my attention to British Empire, which is kind of part of our reflection today. Just to start with, in 1800s, British Empire colonized pretty much about 1.5 million square miles. And that covered about 20 million people, parts of American continent, and also different aspects of the African continent. But by 1900, that's almost 100 years, it increased to 11 million square miles and moved to 390 million people. So you can see the expansion within a century. And that is primarily due to the expansion in parts of Asia and parts of Australia. So occupied land went from 35% to 85% between 1825 and 1925. So East India Company, which was the kind of company rule through which Britain ruled parts of Asia, was part of the charter by Parliament in 1813. And of course, it is in this context the permission for missionary work begins to be provided, because up until that point in time, there weren't any direct missionaries in parts of the empire. So the legalization of India after the first Sepoy Mutiny in 1857 changes India from a company rule to the Raj as we know it. So this is just a kind of a footnote as we begin to expand and understand why this matters in our examination of Church of England. So to start with, I think the idea of the providential empire is very critical because there was this very clear understanding that British Empire was destined by God to rule the world. And this was very important theological, ecclesiological foundation for the empire. So this is why the idea of the providential empire is very critical. And this is where we see the alliance of the church and the empire clearly laid out. And of course, if we were to listen to some of the early voices, we can listen to Daniel Wilson, Bishop of Calcutta in 1832. He said that Anglican establishment was vital to the providential purpose of Britain's Indian empire. So he very clearly laid out the importance of this providential thinking. And then, of course, as one of the important scholars of colonial India observes, Peter van der Weer, there can be little doubt that the simultaneous evangelical activities, a public awareness of a particular kind of world and of an imperial duty of British Christians in the empire. So there was this clear understanding of buying into that providential nature of the empire. And of course, in 1857, to understand this link, Robert Caldwell, another important person in this story, says, the rule of the English and Indian rests on the will of the Most High, the supreme ruler of the nations, who has raised up England and confided race after race and region after region to her care. So you can see how strongly the early understanding of the providential nature of the empire is grounded in the theological worldview of the bishops and the hierarchy of the Church of England at that point in time. And of course, the similar thinking persists within the hierarchy of the Church of England. And of course, one of the important theologians and Bishop Brooke Foss Westcott said in 1875 that the rule of the English, God has fitted us as a church to be the interpreters of the East and of the West to the East, to be the witness and heralds of truth recognized as manifold. So you can see that this is one of the key ideas that Edward Said earlier argued about Orientalist framing of the providential nature of empire. And of course, Mandel Creighton, Bishop of London in 1897, said, the question of the future of the world, the conquest of the world, is the existence of Anglo-Saxon civilization on a religious basis. Just to point out why this matters to us, there are two important aspects. The first is shaping the worldview both at home and throughout the empire. So the important aspect is that there is this kind of English world system that's being shaped within England, but also being exported to shape the wider thinking across the empire. And the second aspect is how, by framing of this theological framework, distribution of power and services through church organizations becomes a critical factor. So it's not simply a theological fact, but also it becomes a practical mechanism through which power is distributed through the empire. So how the British Empire went through the transition is very important, because it changes from East India Company to British Empire, and the Royal Proclamation in 1858 and the Royal Charter that it receives in 1878. And particularly Lord Palmerston, Prime Minister at that time, says it is not only our duty, but it is our interest to promote the diffusion of Christianity as far as possible throughout the whole length and breadth of India. And of course, this is where we begin to see the key manifestation of the providential nature of empire within the whole British Empire. So what we see is the development of Anglican communion within the British Empire. So the idea whether this is an Anglican empire is a question that we will expand on in a little later. But we need to, in order to understand this, needs to go back to Edward Bishop all the way back to 1711, where he said, one of the key people who were part of the earliest formation of the Society for the Propagation of Gospel, he argued that my constitution is constelled for any meridian, and I shall be in any part of the world. Why this framing is very important? Because the idea that Anglicanism, as it was understood within England, within Church of England at that point in time, can be transplanted to any part of the world. So it is this idea of providential nature coming back again in the understanding. So what we see early on is that the changing from Church of England to a worldwide communion, which later on becomes a very important step, an established church, because there was a lot of resistance. It wasn't a very easy process where Church of England was immediately allowed to set up its own infrastructure in the empire, but there was a lot of resistance. But at the same time, there was a clear understanding that the Church of England, through its kind of systems of power, is the best vehicle to support the empire in different parts of the world. And of course, this is where it's an important transition for us to understand that empire had a special place within the church. As the church had a special place in the empire, so was the case the other way around. And if you look at significant accounts during that period between 1800s and 1900, all provincial and diocesan meetings in England at that point in time, the regular speakers in those gatherings were missionaries. And why this is important? Because they brought in this idea of providential nature of the empire, which went out into the empire, came back through the missionary accounts back to the parishes and dioceses and provincial gatherings. And this is where, one of the interesting comment, Samuel Wilberforce, who was the Bishop of Oxford in 1857, says, God has dealt with us in order that we may act as we never yet have acted, with true Christian zeal and courage in the administration of our Eastern Empire. So this idea of the theological providential nature of the empire traveling back and forth is very critical in understanding how Church of England's views were shaped in the 18th and the 19th century. And of course, just as a side note, as Gavri Vishwanathan, one of the very important scholars on the Indian context, writes that the reality of racial superiority and racism within the established church at that point in time was very much exported, was very much translated in different parts of the Indian context and the Indian subcontinent. And so this idea of the empire and Church of England kind of influencing each other in shaping a world, as I mentioned early on, an English worldview, which is very critical for us to understand. And of course, the domestic impact of Anglicization abroad is very important for us to understand, because that kind of provides the basic framework of mission and how it is understood within the context. And of course, we also see some of the processes, sectarianism as a byproduct of British representational strategies was very much at the process. So different groups were trying to have a say within the administration of the empire. Therefore, sectarianism was very much at the heart of how British did business across the empire. And also the prevalence of interwoven straws of nationalist and imperialist interests, and how popular radicalism was thrown into a good measure. A very interesting example is that of John Henry Newman, who was providing a very strong vision for the Catholicity within the Church of England, was also playing with the idea of Englishness, the nationhood of that particular context, and also how he was promoting the understanding of the state within that context. So it's very important that we understand that the Oxford movement, not simply as a reform movement within the Church of England, but also how progressive strategies and political powers were beginning to manifest itself within that particular context. Now, just moving on, I wish to kind of reflect on a couple of points that will help us in making sense of this complex context. So the first aspect is, of course, the missionary Anglicanism. And of course, when we look at historically the Society for the Promotion of the Christian Knowledge, which was founded in 1698 and then continued its work, and of course, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, which was set up in 1701 and later formed as USPG, and of course, the Church Missionary Society. And of course, why I'm making mention of these organizations, if you look at one of the missionary magazines cited by Brian Stanley, as it was written in 1830, this idea of missionary Anglicanism is encapsulated in this statement. Let me just read. It says, "The people are now dressed in British manufactures and make a very respectable appearance in the house of God. The children who formerly went naked and presented a most disgusting appearance are decently clothed. Instead of a few wretched huts resembling pigsties, we now have regular village. The valley in which it stands which till lately was uncultivated, is not laid out now in gardens. So what is this beginning to emerge is the kind of the civilizing element of missionary work. What is important here is that Anglicanism is coterminous with Anglicization, the kind of exporting Englishness that is beginning to emerge in this particular period. But also, there's a very clear connection between the kind of philanthropic missionary work within Church of England at that point in time as a middle class expression of work. And this is very important, how we begin to understand church's involvement in the wider context. The second element is of course, how slavery and the imperial Anglicanism began to interact. Of course, the transatlantic Anglicanism's goal of making colonial societies more orderly, as was pointed out by that observation, played an important role in holding the view that slavery and conversion to Christianity were not only compatible, but could indeed be beneficial. So it was seen as an important collaborators in terms of its presence. And of course, the Society for the Propagation of Gospel, actually are the corporate owners of Codrington Plantation in Barbados, which was handed over to SPG in 1710. And of course, there were instances and records that clearly shows that there were plantation slaves working with a society branded on their chest, so that even if they run away, they will be known who those slaves are, they belong to. In other words, what we begin to see is that to Christianize slavery and making it more secular, secure and regulated. So slavery, it's very important to understand, has a very long history. So it's not just kind of isolated to the British Empire, but also it's part of much of the European Empire and the society at that point in time. So what we see in the case of SPG is that where this missionary Anglicanism, particularly embracing slavery as very much part and parcel of their missionary work. So slave owners, not only as masters, but as Christian masters. So the idea that you can hold these two aspects together was very much here. And of course, Edmund Gibson in 1727, Bishop of London at that time, he says, embracing of the gospel does not make the least alteration in civil property in any of the duties which belong to civil relations, but continues persons just in the same state as it found them. So you could see the kind of articulation of justification for slavery within that context. And of course, there were contrasting views, as was the case with Bishop of London, Porteous's criticism of slavery, where he called it opprobrious traffic. So he really articulated a criticism of the SPG at that point in time. What is important to distinguish here is that they are opposed to slave trade, but not necessarily slavery. So we need to distinguish, yes, of course, there were a lot of noises made at that point in time to abolish slave trade, but not necessarily slavery, which went on for a little longer. So how do we understand the missionaries as slave owners, as masters and pastors? So this is a very important, because much of the support came from the church at home in that case, and how it drew its support. So now coming back to why this brief overview of history matters to us is because looking at Church of England as the established church, so from British Empire to Commonwealth, so there is a very clear transition from the empire, the language of Raj, to a Commonwealth, a shared heritage. So what we see is that here is a transition of Church of England and Anglican communion. So most important thing to keep in mind is that there were different types of Anglicans. And of course, Church of England itself, as we know, was understood as Ecclesia Anglicana, but also as Anglican Church in different parts of the empire and how it presented itself. It had different purposes within the American context. It had a different purpose within the Indian subcontinent and different contexts in Australia and different parts of the African continent. So the key thing for us to understand is that to link and to understand how different types of Anglicanism was lived out and experienced in different parts of the empire. So we shouldn't collapse all these different experiences of Anglicanism into one and say they're all one and the same. Just as different groups within Church of England was operating, the similar manifestations was happening across the empire. And of course, there is the second element of the providential church. The question here is that if the empire was seen as a providential empire, the question then arises whether there was a sense that Church of England itself was seen as a providential church, a church that was called to be a moral and civilizing influence within the society. So this was a very important question, because if you are looking at the empire, then what are the influences back home of a similar worldview of how it's being held domestically? Let me look at some examples. So how power structures within the Church of England was working. One of the key things was that if you look at all the way from 1830s up to 1947 and even further, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, much of the established church, even though it didn't have many converts, was very much run as part of the institutional establishment. So there is a very clear link between how the providential empire was fed through. The established church had a very big, significant buy-in within the church back home. And of course, the church hierarchy matters a lot, because bishops and the ordained process became a very critical mechanism through which these elements were delivered. And of course, another key aspect is the role of church commissioners. Even today, church commissioners play a very significant role. And of course, as we know, church commissioners came to be through the amalgamation of two different bodies. One is the Queen Anne's Bounty, which was set up in 1704, primarily to reclaim some of the resources before that period, but also to provide resources for the local poor parishes. And of course, one of the key research that are beginning to question is that Queen Anne's Bounty had a very clear link to slave trade in 1715 to 1731. So Queen Anne's Bounty had an investment in South Sea Company, which was one of the biggest traders of slaves across the transatlantic slave trade. And the second aspect of the church commissioners, or the ecclesiastical commissioners at that point in time, had a direct link to the company rule all the way up to 1858, because there were several stakeholders who were part of the ecclesiastical commissioners. And then, most crucially, in 1874, when the company was dissolved, many of the stakeholders were very handsomely kind of provided with the amount of from the dissolution of the company. Basically, the stakeholders were paid off. And the third element is, of course, there were many regular members of the Church of England who all were part of the slave ownership. Very It's almost kind of holding shares and stakes in different economic investment. As we are beginning to learn, even in Lancaster itself, there were several local members who are mentioned within the Lancaster's history who owned the slaves, but they never met because they financially benefited from it. So within Church of England, there was both tangible, visible manifestation of the empire, but also invisible economic benefits of the empire. So to bring it all together, the questions that I pose for us for our conversation today is, what is a decolonial perspective on power within the questions about Church of England that we need to be aware of? What I suggest is that history has knowledge, because when history is understood in the right context, it becomes a very important source of power. How we shape and how the Church of England has come to be, and how it will enable us to engage with some of the challenges. And this is where the idea of power as a sense, a common sense, an understanding of agency, how we make sense of our own place within this history. And Church of England, when we talk about all the different strands, sectarianism as a byproduct of a very unique British representational strategy. It's not something, it's there by mistake, but it's a very conscious thing where different groups mobilize around different ideas, which was very much encouraged not only within the political establishment, but also within Church of England for centuries, which can be seen through the colonial lenses. And the third challenge for this reflection is, of course, the idea of how the interwoven straws of nationalist and imperialist interests and popular radicalism, how they find resonance within the structures of Church of England, where we begin to see being part of Church of England is part of being English, being part of the national identity. And also, of course, most recently, even as recent as the last General Synod, we had people and discussions around how the British Empire was a gift to the world. This deep-seated understanding very much exists. And of course, it also becomes a space where popular radicalism, just like that of John Henry Newman, can be shaped within that context. It's very important. Why I'm saying that is that you cannot separate them from one another, but need to be understood in tension, in dynamic relationship with one another. But also there was this idea of normalizing opposing positions, the tendency to kind of somehow hold extremely opposing views, and in the process, very often legitimizing some unjust practices. This is where kind of the understanding that Gayatri Spivak and others have offered in terms of power, understanding power, becomes very critical. One of the key concluding points that I wish to say is that how ethics is very often is a constructed framework. We construct ethical code of practice. However, justice, on the other hand, demands that ethics recast itself to understand that there are other subjects other than normative one. So who becomes the normative one gets to decide the ethical structures, whereas justice demands that we actually rethink. So to conclude, colonialism is very much part of the Church of England's history, because Church of England gave the theological impetus and framing of the providential nature of the empire. If we want to constructively engage with the Church of England today and see how it can flourish, we need to consciously look how this power operates within different structures of the church, where we see the resources of power being operational in different ways. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anderson. Wow, that was fascinating. Thank you for giving us such an amazing kind of whistle-stop tour of the history of the Church of England and its relationship to colonialism. And thank you also for reminding us that history wasn't just then and we are now, but actually we're part of history. It hasn't finished yet. So I would like to give us a brief break. Just like 3 minutes, so if we can come back at 10 to 3, that would be great. And then we'll start taking questions. So please be ready with your questions for Anderson then. Thank you. Great, welcome back. I've had a question just asking about how we do questions. So what we'd like to do is encourage you to talk to Anderson so he can hear your voices. So if you have a question, please could you use the raise your hand button, which is at the bottom of your screen. I think it's under reactions. There's a button for raise hand. So if you can use that, then I'll be able to see that you'd like to speak, and I'll call your name, and then you can unmute yourself and turn your camera on so that Anderson can see who he's talking to. But please, if you'd like to write in the chat as well, then feel free to do that too. Great, thank you. So we have a question from Phil to start off with. Go for it, Phil.
Hi, Anderson. It's great to be here. It's really fascinating. And of course, you and I know my experience is much more through Africa and the USA. I was going to say the interesting thing for me is that the undermining of those imperialist claims by English bishops seemed to me become from those who accepted the gospel and read the scriptures, and also from those parts of the communion that were outside the empire. And one of those great, my suspicion is that in India, that would have been by the non-Anglican mission that was then incorporated into the United Churches. So Congregationalists and so on and so forth, and Baptists and what have you. And in East Africa, that would have been very much by the interpretation of the gospel in what was the Belgian Rwanda, which became the East African Revival, that challenged power in imperialist kind of Uganda and Kenya, and gave voice to ordinary people, and particularly to women who confronted the hierarchical power, and they're spread into Kenya and into Tanzania and to Sudan, and undermined that imperialism. I wonder if you have any thoughts about, and then inspired mission in, for example, in Congo, which was outside the empire, by Africans, no British missionaries, but the Anglican mission in Congo was by Ugandans at first. I wonder if you have kind of thoughts about how it seemed to me that, you know, it was always undermined because possibly, and I have a hunch, it's because of the power of the gospel itself.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's, you know, for every story, there's always multiple sides. How we understand that story is very often from where you're standing and looking at it. As you said, you know, again, speaking from primarily from a South Asian perspective, there were very many dissenting voices, even within the Anglican establishment, who challenged many of the orders that came from London. Most prominently, you know, like Bishop Heber and others really took things on their own and challenged some of the framework. What is very interesting for me is that how different organizations functioned when threatened about their existence, very often towed the line of the status quo. So they needed to observe the protocol. So there were several communications, both from SPG trustees and CMS trustees to their missionaries, you know, be subservient to your masters in that context. Therefore, you're not simply kind of doing your own important thing. So even some of the missionaries who wanted to challenge, for instance, in Indian context, the caste practices were in many ways excluded from the main framework. The key point that I wish to, and similar examples could be elicited from even in the North African context and West African context, in Ghana and in Nigerian context, where, you know, for instance, in the Cape Coast situation, where the British joined in the slave trade much later, because there were already other European powers doing the slave trade. So they didn't have much of a say on deciding what is good and what is right and proper. But at the same time, there were a lot of critical voices, both local and missionaries who went into that process challenge. So the first response is, of course, the power of the gospel itself really challenged that very process. But at the same time, it also, I think there was a very real tension between the institutional nature of the empire and the church to a certain extent, and the power of the gospel as a liberating power. So this is where we need to kind of constantly see that it's all not one side of the story, but actually you need to constantly locate how it is experienced. And the same thing could be said in the American context, in, you know, Southern California and other areas where SPG was the main source of the Church of England's presence, but that itself has become the main source of projecting a different frame of Anglicanism in that context.
Thank you.
And I don't know if you know this, but in Tanzania, which was German East Africa, the CMS missionaries were commanded, and the UMCA missionaries, and UMCA is important, were commanded to return home because they were in somebody else's colony, and they refused. And that was seen as undermining the colonial situation. So the white missionaries were seen as being anti-colonial, and the churches were burnt down by Germans and that kind of thing. Yeah, anyway, sorry, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
No, great, thank you. Thanks, Phil. Eileen.
Thank you very much, Anderson. That was so much, but so clearly presented. I would make a couple of comments and then questions on the back of that. In your mention of post-colonialism, you mentioned about how there needed to be decolonization and a process that of transfers of power, and then you also mentioned about residual features, and you defined decolonization in terms of transforming knowledge production and so on. And it occurs to me, and I wonder whether you would concur with this, that one of the reasons why it's quite difficult for the Church of England today to change or transform unjust structures or culturally be something different, is because this decolonization process was one way. So the decolonization happened with the withdrawal of British people who were sent out to be dominant in all the structures at the top of all the governance and power and so on, that when they withdrew, the countries that were no longer colonies were told that they could get rid of what structures had been in place and so on. But that decolonization in mindset and attitude and so on, I don't think took place in Britain itself. That means that the idea of the providential empire was still retained in the people who identify themselves as being from this country. Therefore, really, colonialism continues today, and the church, in not decolonizing itself, is perpetuating it. I'd appreciate your comment on that.
No, I think that's a very critical observation, and that's why when I concluded, I finished with that point and the question whether we need to examine our own theologies and ecclesiology within Church of England today, whether there is that sense of providential nature still exists within our thinking, that we are the church of the land. Therefore, we need to have the moral standing to civilize, to bring the presence of Christ into that community. There's a responsibility, but at the same time, there's a danger. This is why we need to look at history as a source of our knowledge for today. If not, we will end up doing the same mistake as we have done in the past. And that is why you're exactly on the point that decolonization has not taken place, because we still operate in many of those same frameworks, both theological as well as our biblical understanding how scripture was utilized. For instance, slavery is not a new thing. Slavery was very much part and parcel of our human society in different ways and different forms. If you look at through the European expansion, Genesis and various aspects of slave ownership was used to legitimize aspects of private property. So why I'm saying that? Because we use scripture in a similar way, even today, to justify and to legitimize certain aspects of defining how people are and who people are and where they are. And this is where I think decolonization is not simply about a post-colonial context. It's also about rethinking how we imagine the world around us. If we primarily look at the world from what I said, during which propelled much of the British Empire as kind of Anglicizing the entire world, we will be in a big danger because that, you know, as someone who's always teaching to international relations students, this is one of the problems. If Britain in the global order, if I can make that example, in the global order thinks that, oh, we still are this empire, go around telling people what to do, soon you will face the backlash. And just imagine that in the local context, if the church, why there is so much of criticism of the church as the establishment, there is a sense of entitlement, and we need to be very critical of that entitlement and how we can be constructive.
Can I just make two comments on the back of that quite quickly? One is there is a hidden and deeper aspect that has not been dealt with, because many of the countries that have been colonized and dominated, the people there have a huge sense of guilt, because many of the business leaders and the political leaders in those countries only realized after the fact that they were in collusion with embarrassing their own people by destroying their own culture and by accepting this subjugation that had been put on them. And because of their embarrassment and guilt, they've not spoken up. And so that aspect, it's deeply sad, but there's no redress. So that's one aspect. The other thing is, a positive thing is, there were people, missionaries like Morrison, who went out to Southeast Asia and Hong Kong and China and Macau, who was not supported by the authorities, but insisted on going, and he did it a lot on his own back because he refused to carry the colonialism, imperialism agenda. And the power of the gospel enabled people like Morrison to achieve so much more. And I say that with personal experience of generations of my own ancestry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you. We've got a question from Becky. We've also got some comments in the chat as well coming up.
Thank you so much, Anderson, for your presentation, and also Eileen for your wisdom. Just really, I suppose my question would echo that and one in the chat. When we're talking very seriously about this process of decolonization, I just wondered whether you could speak to the issue of reparation. You were so really moving on the demands of justice, and I just wondered, as someone said in the chat as well, whether you could speak to where we are with decolonization and reparation in the Church of England. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very conscious that, you know, the moment we mentioned reparation, it really puts everybody off because it's a topic. It's a theme that needs to be dealt with care, and I see Dean's comment as well, because there needs to be a deep sense of integrity if we want to really engage with this process, and that involves a clear understanding of where we have come from and how we have treated one another. And I think this is what Eileen also pointed out. And I think we are still yet to fully embrace our past. We are yet to fully embrace in all its complexity, good and bad and evil ones, where we have been colluders in the colonial exploitation, where people's lives have been taken, were dehumanized, and were pretty much exterminated in the context. So that place of embracing that history and then work through what are the ways we need to address. And the first and foremost is to actually start acknowledging our failures. And I think this is where we have not fully embraced our past. And this brings us to the question, that's why I pointed out at the end, where it's not simply about ethics. Ethics are very often developed by those who are in power. And that's why we need to actually approach these questions from the area of justice, because justice, as Christians, justice as it has been given to us from our understanding of God, this is a big and important issue for us to be approaching. And that would mean that how are we going to kind of compensate the lives that has been lost, compensate for the hurt, the trauma of history. This is a big area that we need to think. And the first place, if I may suggest, and of course, this is not something that you can simply pay off something to somebody, but this is a deep institutional change. And I see that Mike has posted in the comment, there has to be an institutional change, and institutions don't simply change unless individuals change. This is where, when I talk about power, it's very easy to say the power that is very often not able to be pinned down, but something that needs to be really recognized how dynamic it is and how individuals can implement. The second part of that is, of course, we need to carefully think how this reparation would look like. Is it simply addressing the past, or is it actually paving the way? There are several organizations within England that have taken very affirmative action. For example, the Council for World Mission as one of the processes that has actually sold some of its properties in parts of Singapore and in Southeast Asia, and actually reinvested in enabling communities and helping communities to think and educate and act differently. So there are different ways of addressing, but I am, of course, very keen to work out how that would look like within Church of England, because my sense is that, having been part and parcel of the institution and the institutional structure, we are not there yet, because we are still struggling to get our voice in to say, actually, we need to seriously think what it means to be a person coming from different parts of the world and call still ourselves as Anglican. And that, of course, I had to convince from a personal experience, 15 years ago, I have to convince my own diocese that I am actually a legitimate person within the Anglican community. There are basic things that need to be challenged. And we have a very long way, unfortunately. But as Mike said, we are in the process of addressing it. We are, at least, have arrived in a place where we could have these conversations in public. And I'm hopeful that the structures and the powers to be will take up these questions seriously.
Thank you, Anderson. And you've also picked up there on Sunita's comment in the chat as well about the importance of actively challenging racist thinking and enabling a dismantling of colonial structures and systems that still pervade in the Anglican Church, and the importance of ordinands and also other members of the Church to be able to engage in this kind of thinking as well. We've got some more questions from people, so I'd like to invite Michael, please.
Anderson, many thanks. Anderson and I were colleagues together for a little while. I think my question is, I was fascinated, it's got me going in a whole host of ways. And my question is actually about this sort of chain of power. And what I observe is that those who historically have gained power actually are very clever and are very adept at ensuring that they then maintain power and dress in different clothes, change systems and adapt systems so that they can actually keep the status quo, even if they've made a pretense or a presentation of being different. And that's neocolonialism, and actually that's part of the structures perhaps of things like the Church of England in colluding with new areas of power and influence, both within this country and beyond. So the first question is that we need to take care with our language of justice to be the justice that you articulated and not the justice that I think others have hinted at, political regimes might articulate as being such, because then we're going back into the colonial dynamic. But there's also this sort of entrenched position that the Church of England actually doesn't learn very much from its wider Anglican communion in which it is placed, and still holds on to, even with shifting language, the main part of that power chain. So how can we actually start to shift that dynamic?
Yeah, no, I think you have very helpfully kind of delinked those two aspects, and I think we need to be very careful how we frame questions around justice, and otherwise we end up replicating the same power structures that we are trying to critique. And very often, and that's one of the important areas, reflections that we can glean from the studies around hegemony, how hegemony works, how people who assume power through these kind of structures can actually become perpetrators of those very power that they were critiquing. Therefore, I think this is where the Christian gospel, which I am very fond of, for many missionaries who sacrificed all they had to go and proclaim the gospel in such a way that people could have life, and life in all its fullness. So this is where it comes to the second question, where the Church of England can really learn from the experiences of those missionaries and the Church of England in other parts of the world, where it was able to reimagine what it meant to be the church in that context. And this is where, instead of Anglican communion very often going in one direction, it needs to be a real communion, a real solidarity. My thinking is that we are still struggling with the mindset of a commonwealth, where we still have a power center in one geographical location where decisions are made. And I think that needs to change. That needs to be much more inclusive, and that should open up more disagreements, more engagement, and more criticism. Because if power is centralized, and this is my fundamental thing that I get from decolonization, is that it can be very easily hijacked in different ways. So we need to be always conscious how power and where it is located and who gets to implement it. And Church of England, very interestingly, very often is still in many ways being governed by those invisible powers and networks and circles where decisions are made. And that needs to be changed and challenged. And the gospel has to be seriously preached in that context.
Thank you. Philip, you got a question?
I have. Thank you very much. And thank you, Anderson, because I think your exercise is one of shaping our historical imagination and raising historical consciousness. And so I did have it's really a question around your quote from Bishop Westcott, which and where that comes from, and perhaps Westcott's own thinking, because I wonder if it's possible to do some distinctions and draw out some of the nuances in some of those quotes and the people you're quoting, because some of those figures, I had this picture of, well, really an Anglican tendency to just bless those in power. I'm almost minded of Bonhoeffer's phrase of cheap grace. You just say, well, God approves of this, and God approves of this empire, and this looks good. And I think the Church of England has a habit of doing that over all sorts of things now, and not relating that to the full radical power of the gospel. But the quote I think you had from Westcott, where he's taking up that role, talking about being interpreters from of the East and West to the East. Westcott had a particular view, his own historical consciousness, awareness as a New Testament translator, of how the gospel had been translated into the Roman Empire, into the Greek and Roman cultures. And so Westcott very much looked at India as a parallel civilization, if you like, or culture that the gospel needed to be interpreted into. And yes, that came with all sorts of hubris and assumed cultural superiority while he did it, but it had a missional intention, if you see what I mean. It was that the gospel had been brought to Europe by being related to Greek and Roman culture. Therefore, the gospel should be brought to India by relating to Indian culture. So I wondered if it's worth us drawing out those nuances, because that's a deeper intellectual engagement with what's going on in empire, if you see what I mean, than possibly that assumed cheap grace, blessing, God must be in this because it's the British Empire.
Yeah, no, thanks for alerting me to that. However, and I think the reason that I wanted to bring in Westcott is that, of course, Westcott is a recognized theologian bishop who in many ways provided the kind of intellectual infrastructure for the church at that point in time, because he was one of the well-respected theologians. I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, when you read, this is the wider criticism of the systematic theological articulation at that point in time, which was the privileged position of the European way of thinking, which, for all its merits, also had challenges that it still needed to be interpreted. It still needed to be fleshed out for the wider world and not accepted as they are. Do you get, this is where I was locating Westcott, not necessarily in a sense as one who was far more in the sense of kind of people like Caldwell and others who were kind of advocates of the empire. Westcott was more of a theological provisioning of that authority, which was not something, probably this is something that is expected of a bishop to say at that point in time. I wish we could time travel and inquire him why he made, and this is something that is many bishops do say that. And the reason I wanted to cite all these bishops is my own reading of the bishops today, how Church of England bishops very often put themselves in a place where they might have a different theological preoccupation, but at the same time, in order to consolidate the institutional power, very often articulate, as you said, the kind of cheap grace that has been said, but it takes courage, as we have seen most recently with regards to the Rwanda plan. It takes courage to stand up and critique. But at the same time, we were also aware that how some of the changes that weren't really challenged within the House of Lords, for instance, where the bishops were present. And of course, there was that nuanced approach that we need to take. And of course, the more engaged reaction, and if I can point out, Stuart Brown has written a fantastic article on looking at some of the theological contributions to providential empire in one of the articles, which I'm very happy to send a link, and where he looks at how theology shaped some of the historical structures at that point in time.
Thank you.
Thank you. A question, you mentioned the House of Lords there, and there's a question in the chat about just talking about the House of Lords and what does justice look like as we move forward. So, for example, how would this influence the House of Lords and the Church of England in it?
My sense is that I think power is not necessarily evil. Power is not necessarily bad. I think power needs to be exercised, and that's why I'm very careful in framing that agency and a sense of how we operationalize power needs to be understood. I think the debate about kind of whether to have the House of Lords or not, that's a whole different area. But we have a historical reality here where you have 26 bishops, the Lord spirituals, are sitting in that place of decision making and policy making. And I think they have done a reasonably good job in the past 2 years by challenging some of the government policies. I think therein lies how, when you have people who have come, I would like to particularly single out Bishop Gully from her own experience. She has been able to speak very powerfully for some of the important debates. So if you, I really wish not very late in the future, I hope someone with a direct link to the experience of transatlantic slavery can sit in the House of Lords and question and challenge with the authenticity that experience can bring. And I'm sure that will change the dynamics. And someone like Paul Boateng, for example, is already challenging it. Wish we could make him a bishop, but I don't think he wants to be a bishop. But he's already challenging from that standpoint. So House of Lords, yes, an important place of power, but how can the church responsibly exercise its power in that place?
Thank you. Hannah, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. My question is a little bit about this narrating of history, given my background as a historian. And I was wondering, Anderson, if you could speak a little bit more about this idea of decolonizing knowledge and how that might play into that process of narrating history, because it seems to me that the way, certainly I was taught to tell history and to study history and to think about truth and fact, and the historical narrative is not the most helpful in this process. So I wondered if you could speak a little more about that.
Thank you, Hannah. I think it's very important because I began as a theologian, but I've become more interested in history, because the more you examine questions of theology, you begin to see that there are historical precedences where it is located. And also, I think you would probably agree that we need to change looking at history in a linear fashion, as if it all happened in a chronological order. But that's not the case. And I think history is a very messy kettle of fish. So how do we engage? And this is where, when I look at it from a kind of a decolonization perspective, this is where we need to take control of the knowledge production itself. So how do we develop knowledge? How do we articulate a new intellectual questioning, intellectual capacity to engage with the reality. So when we think of history, I think history is alive. History is alive with people's experiences. So we also need to bring in an element of subjectivity in understanding that element into our conversation. So to bring into the conversation that we are looking at today, I think looking back, not in a kind of a nostalgic way, but actually what it can inform us about our institutions and powers and structures today, and what we can learn from it and how we can make it better. And this is where kind of decolonization of knowledge comes into play, because decolonization is not only just critiquing the past, but it's actually actively constructing something new for the betterment of the community today. So it's not just about kind of simply examining the past, but actually actively shaping the future and the present. And decolonization is a very critical process. And that is why it needs to involve history, theology, doctrine, and ecclesiology, and how we can shape. And if I can say, I think that's what Jesus did in his own time. He was in many ways was decolonizing his own context, where people have lost the ability to imagine a different reality. And he was actively helping people to reimagine a different world. And I think that challenge remains even for us today, not to simply rest on the laurels of the past, but actually actively shape the future.
Thank you, and thank you so much for ending it, for bringing this to an end on a challenge like that. Anson, thank you so much. You opened up a whole range of different threads, and people responded, and you've given us an awful lot to think about. Thank you for helping us, as someone said in the chat, to engage with this more critically. And thank you everyone for joining us as well. This was, as I said, the third webinar in the series, which is all about power in the Church of England. We have some more webinars, not quite scheduled, but in the pipeline for the autumn. So this will be the last one for this academic year, and we'll have some more set up for the autumn. So I think Mike, who is in the background managing all of this, is going to put in the chat, although he's done it, he's put in the chat a link where you can find, you'll be able to find, I think, the recordings of this webinar and the previous ones, and also details of any upcoming webinars as well. And we're also really happy to receive suggestions for future themes and topics, so you can send that to any of us that you know. Mike Higdon is probably the one that you have the details for, contact details for. So please, yeah, we're really happy to receive suggestions on anything to do with power in the Church of England, or any speakers who you think might be great to have on. So yeah, thank you again, and thank you again to our wonderful signers as well. You've worked really hard, and we're really grateful to you for that. So I wish you all a lovely rest of the afternoon.